everybody, this is Vince Miller. Thank you for joining me for a brand new study in the book of Job. Now, this book is dedicated to the exciting topic of suffering. But here's the deal. It's the story of a blameless and an upright man who appears to be undeserving of the suffering that he endured. You see, we don't have a problem with suffering when it happens to disobedient and unrighteous people, right? In fact, we love it when someone who has done injustice receives justice, especially when they've been unjust to us. We love it when a person who cuts us off in traffic gets pulled over a few miles up the road. At least that's how I imagine it in my mind, right? Yet when a righteous man suffers for doing right, we struggle with this. We have a problem with it because we see it as unjust and unfair. Therefore, it causes us to ask some pretty big questions about the justice of God. And this is the topic of the book of Job. So before we begin, let's do a brief flyover of this 42 chapter book. First, Job is the central character. He is a man of profound character, and he appears to be the prototype of a godly man, husband, father, and leader. In fact, he has amassed a great name for himself on earth and in heaven. But the plot thickens. We get a peek behind the divine curtain at a conversation held in the spiritual realm. It's a conversation of which Job is, well, he's not privy. So we get to hear a dialogue that God has with a fallen angel, Satan. And Satan begs God to give him an opportunity to test the character and faithfulness of Job. And so chapters 1 through 3 chronicle the limits of Job's faith in God. Then in chapters 3 through 42, which is the rest of the book, we read about one day in the life of Job. Yes, one day. And in this day, Job has 3 major conversations. Now, that first conversation is with 3 friends who come to console him and offer their advice. Their names are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And their conversation with Job consumes a majority of the book. It's all the chapters between 4 and 31. They basically console him one at a time with a series of looping conversations. They each take a turn, and then Job responds to each, and it loops almost 3 times in entirety. First, Eliphaz speaks, then Job responds, then Bildad speaks, then Job responds, then Zophar speaks, and then Job responds. Then this repeats a second and a third time, except each time the advice from the friends get shorter and Job's responses get longer. Basically, the sum of their advice is this: you have sinned, God is punishing you, you need to repent. And they blame his suffering on some known or unknown personal sin and call for his repentance so the suffering will stop. I think they do what anyone would do from a natural perspective. They come to the wrong conclusion, thus give the wrong advice, primarily because they lacked awareness of what was happening in the divine. And while all this is happening, we wonder if Job is finally going to break. Now, the second of these conversations is one between Job and Elihu, and it's found in chapters 32 through 37. Now, Elihu is a younger man who has been listening to the conversation with the 3 men. And when he speaks, we discover he's pretty angry with the counsel from the 3 men. But in addition, he's also angry with Job. He feels Job has responded in self-righteousness, that he's made too much of his righteousness and therefore self-justified himself in defense of himself. The essence of Elihu's speech is powerful. It's crazy good. It starts like an angry rant and then moves to the praise of the greatness of God. The sum of his speech is this: that God is sovereign, right? Man cannot comprehend him, and our righteousness does not dictate his action. It's powerful. And then the third and final conversation is one between God and Job. This is definitely the apex of the book. This is found in chapters 38 through 42, and essentially God picks up where Elihu left off. There's this whirlwind, and God speaks out of it. And God's initial statement is this. It's crazy good. God says, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me." And finally, at the end of the book, Job comes to his senses about his self-righteousness. He realizes God is God and he is not. And therefore, he confesses and repents of his self-righteousness. And of course, in the end, a blessing abounds in Job's life, greater than before, but with a greater understanding of God's righteousness and his unrighteousness. So there's a quick flyover of the entire book. Now, in this session, we're going to look at most of the first chapter, and we're going to attempt to answer one of the hardest questions that mankind asks about God, which is this: why do bad things happen to good people? And we're going to do this by looking at Job chapter 1 and seeing his amazing response to evil and suffering in his life. The following are 4 scenes in Job's life. 4 scenes in Job's life. Here's scene number 1. It's a selfless spiritual leader. I want to read for you the first few words of Job. And this is really the entire setup. Here's verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people in the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. So the first few words of this book set us up to know a number of things about Job. First, where he lived. Second, the nature of his character. Third, the extent of his wealth. And fourth, the size of his family. But I think what's most interesting is how this section concludes. It focuses on the selfless concern that Job had for his family's spiritual well-being. In fact, these last few verses here are super enlightening about Job's heart for his family. We see that he's far more concerned about his family's righteousness with God than the accumulation of anything temporal in his life. And I think this action really helps us to see the true motive of this guy. Gentlemen, this is spiritual leadership, by the way, which is a great lesson for us as men, as husbands, as fathers, and leaders. Here are a couple of marks of his spiritual leadership. Mark number 1 is this: he makes spiritual leadership a priority, a real priority. The text says this, is that he would rise early in the morning. And so we see that his first morning thought is about his family. In this situation, and on this day, his kids were on his mind. And he is genuinely concerned about them. And remember, Job was a busy man. I mean, in verse 3, the author states that he was one of the wealthiest and largest ranchers in all the East. Yet, even though the busyness of his business was calling, he set all that aside. He had another priority on this day. It was the priority for the unseen spiritual leadership of his family. Fellas, we should have the same kind of priority for the spiritual leadership of our family. It should be our first waking thought. Yet I know this isn't true for so many fathers and husbands. This is because we have other pressing priorities at the beginning of our day. We feel compelled to pursue our careers and provide financially for our family to the exclusion of spiritual provision. Thus, spiritual leadership becomes an afterthought in our lives. And fellas, this has to change for us as men and spiritual leaders in every one of our homes. We need to stop exclusively feeding the ego in the pursuit of our career and feed our families spiritually. And we can do this very simply by praying for them at the start of each day. This is a great habit. Just spend a couple of minutes at the start of each day praying privately for them and watch how your leadership and focus changes. Here's mark number 2, though. He focuses spiritual leadership on others. You know, we see in this text here, too, that Job makes this selfless offering. The text describes it this way. Here's what it says about him. Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. Now, burnt offerings were required as a means of atonement for sin throughout the Old Testament. What someone would do is bring an unblemished animal from their herd or flock and offer their life on the altar for their sin. Now, this means of atonement served to remind a follower of their depravity. And you will notice here, Job did not offer a sacrifice for himself, which would have been customary in his day. But instead, he acts very selflessly and offers a series of 10 burnt offerings, one for each of his children, out of concern for them, and the possibility that they might have sinned against God. You know, I think this should be very convicting for husbands and fathers today. Christianity should be flooded with men like this, men who think about themselves less and have a higher spiritual concern for others, especially those within our own families. But this type of selfless spiritual leadership only happens if we have been touched by God's need for grace in our own life and want the same grace for others. And so, where some of us might need to begin is with receiving grace and then finding ways to immediately extend it to others by being generous with the riches of God's character, praying for them, serving them, giving to them, and loving on others. So there is your first scene. Scene number 2 is this. It's a divine proposition. There's this divine proposition that is made. Now I'm going to come back to this section of scripture in the next session, but I want you to see one verse here. Verse 8 reads this way. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? Now, guys, this is a significant moment because we get to see something we usually don't get to see. It's a look behind the veil. And even Job is not privy to this conversation or this moment. It's a divine meeting actually about Job. And in this moment, God appears to invite Satan to test his finest man. And thus, we're set up for what happens next. Scene number 3. A first disaster. A first disaster. Now, I call this the first disaster because there are 2, by the way. And this first one has a number of parts. Here's the story in verses 13 through 19. It reads this way. Now, there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell upon them and took them and struck them down, the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another, and he said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck them down, the servants, with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So 4 messengers bear 4 devastating messages. It is a combination of both natural disaster and physical harm that tests Job's faith in God. He is tested with the theft of possessions, the killing of workers, a fire that burns animals and servants, and a wind that took his children as well. This is essentially a moment that we would wish on no one who is righteous. And what is challenging about this disaster is that God permits it. We clarified this back at point 2. And so this begs the question, the big question. Why do bad things happen to good people? It's a very challenging question, if not the most challenging question that any man will ask. It's challenging because we have to wrestle with the collision between 2 things. First, the existence of evil, and then second, the existence of a sovereign God. And as humans who reason within the limits of human understanding, we have a hard time reconciling the 2, don't we? Therefore, we look for ways to make sense out of them. And to make sense out of this question, we do one of 2 things. We either reduce the existence of evil or reduce the existence of a sovereign God. And let's talk about both. First, let's talk about reducing the existence of evil. Now, do you realize that our question itself attempts to reduce evil? Again, the question is this: why do bad things happen to good people? The question itself supposes that we or someone is good. It assumes that we are not evil and therefore do not deserve to suffer. But the Bible never states that we are good. In fact, the Bible says actually quite the opposite. It says that we are bad in the worst way. Here's Romans 3:23. It reads, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." You see this? It proclaims that evil and sin are no small issue. Evil is a massive problem in all forms. It's a problem both with natural evil in the form of natural disaster and moral evil in the form of sin and selfishness that lives inside of you and me. Yet we want to assume that we're good because we don't want to be on the hook for sin and evil. We would prefer to assume that we are good or mostly good with little culpability for sin and the suffering that comes from it, right? But if we assume that we are good or mostly good, then we have to wrestle with what I read in James chapter 2, verses 10 through 11, which reads this way: "For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. For he who said, 'Do not commit adultery,' also said, 'Do not murder.' If you do not commit adultery but do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law." The point is this: we may think we are good, but really we are not. We're only good according to our measure of our goodness, not according to God's measure of his goodness. Therefore, we have a flaw in our question that attempts to reduce actually the evil within us, and we'll come back to this in a second. Second, we can also choose to reduce God. This is another way we try to make sense out of the problem of evil, is actually by reducing God's sovereignty. Now, let's come back to the original question again. Let's recognize that the question is being asked of God. We could ask it this way: why does an all-powerful and loving God let bad things happen to good people? Right? This question is very theological, but we have to remember it's a deeply personal question. We ask this most often when we go through a time of great suffering. You know, even I have asked it. And we usually ask it because we feel our suffering from a natural or moral evil is undeserved and maybe, well, unbearable. So we want to know, why is God doing it after all? For example, we ask this question when a disease sweeps across the world and takes millions of innocent lives, or when an evil person murders an innocent person or child. It's in these moments we turn to God and ask him, why? Why do you allow this to happen? And what we're trying to do is make sense of why people suffer and why God allows it. Yet so many Christians, in seeking the answer, will actually reduce God's sovereignty. In these tragic moments, we try to find a way to save God of his sovereignty because we don't want him to be responsible for suffering in this life. We don't want God to be on the hook for evil or any kind of suffering, so we reduce him and his sovereignty. But ultimately, a sovereign God is responsible for everything. This includes the allowance of evil and suffering. Now, this is not to infer that God does evil, but he allows evil, both natural and moral evil. Yet he remains sovereign over it all. And we do not need to help God or save God or reduce God to make sense out of evil. In fact, Job doesn't reduce God's sovereignty in his own suffering. Just look at 4 transactions in chapter 1 that elevate God's sovereignty. First is Job 1:8. It reads this way, "And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my certain servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" Now, this is God and Satan in a verbal interchange. Do not be confused about this. God called a meeting, and Satan was required to be there. Remember, Satan is a fallen angel who's allowed by God to walk and roam the earth. So what you see in this is God's sovereign power, authority, and control. And as these two confer, God presents Job as a viable option, not because he hates Job, but because he sees that Job is a blameless and upright man, and he wants to use Job to put Satan in his place. Is God out of control here? No. God is acting and speaking in his sovereignty. He's not previously sovereign and now not, as he gives permission to Satan to tempt man. The second verse is this, Job 1 verse 11. It reads this way. Satan says, "But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." Now here, Satan is testing God. Satan is trying to get God to do something that he knows that God can do. Because get this, even Satan knows that God is totally sovereign. And in God's total sovereignty, Satan knows that God can stretch out his hand and destroy all that Job has. And of course, this does happen. God ultimately allows Satan to touch all Job has. Is God still sovereign in this moment? The answer is yes. Third verse, Job 1 verse 16 reads this way. "While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." You know, even the servants bearing this awful news recognize that God sent the fire. They actually call it the fire of God. Now, we can try to explain this away by calling it a natural disaster or a volcanic explosion or some kind of meteorite. But remember, natural evil and moral evil are not outside the sovereign control of an all-powerful God. The fourth verse is this, Job 1, verse 21. "And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Now note this. Job has no problem with the fact that God allowed this. He knows that God is in sovereign control. So if Job doesn't have a problem with this, neither should we. In fact, he perceives it this way, and it results in something beautiful. It results in praise. Now, we should note that as the story progresses, Job's view of his righteousness gets a little bit too high, and his view of God gets a little too low. But here in this moment, his view of God is very high. And because his view of God is very high, God is proved right and Satan is proved wrong. Again, this means that when we try to reduce God's sovereignty by letting God off the hook for moral and natural suffering and evil, we may miss the opportunity to shame Satan and shout to God. So, let's agree that evil exists and God exists, and that we do not want to reduce the problem of evil or reduce the sovereignty of God. If we can keep from doing these two things, then we can come up with a simple answer to our question. And here is the simple answer to the problem of evil and suffering. Bad things happen to all people because our world reaps the effects of our disobedience to God in the garden. Here's what Romans chapter 5, verse 12 says. It says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, that's Adam, and death, that's all kinds of death, spiritual and physical death, through sin. And so death spread to all men because all sinned. And the bad news is that one act of disobedience by Adam resulted in suffering for all mankind. This means that we suffer for Adam's sin. But just when you think you're an innocent sufferer because Adam sinned and you didn't, you have to face off with Romans 3:23, which reads this way: for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. This means that even though we might think we're an innocent sufferer, we are not. We are just as guilty as Adam. We're not exempt from sin, nor are we exempt from suffering due to sin. Even when suffering from someone else's sin. Everyone has sinned. Everyone suffers. In fact, the only person who is able to legitimately ask our big question today, why do bad things happen to good people, would be Jesus Christ. He was the only truly good or righteous man to ever live. He was sinless in every way, and yet he too suffered at the hand of sinful and unrighteous men. Was this fair? Well, in one respect, yes, because he was subject to a natural law and lived in a world full of sin and suffering. In another respect, of course it wasn't fair, because he was righteous and did not deserve to suffer, but he chose to do so. And he suffered evil as the only good and righteous man for the purpose of bringing glory to a sovereign God. And I think this helps us to arrive at an answer to our original question today. It could be correctly asked this way: why do bad things happen to a good person, the only good person, Jesus Christ? And here is the answer to the right question. Bad things happen to Jesus Christ, the only righteous man, to magnify God's glory. That's the answer. To magnify God's glory. Where there's one final scene in the show today, it's scene 4. It's a godly response. And I think this scene is amazing. Right here at the end of the chapter, God is magnified through Job, and it's beautiful. Here's the text. I've already read a portion of it. I want you to see the whole thing. It's verses 20 through 22. Then Job arose and tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I've come from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. You see, Job doesn't have a problem with God being sovereign, nor does he have a problem with Satan perpetuating evil and suffering. In fact, at this moment, his view of God is very high. God's sovereignty is the more than the sum of his possessions and his property and his workers and his land and his money, his wealth, and even the children that he prayed for. I know this is hard to fathom. It's probably hard to conceive. But remember, Satan suggested that Job believes in God only because God protected him. Satan thinks that Job's going to cave once all these things are gone. He thinks that all these things were the focus of Job's worship, but that isn't the case. And Job's response proves Satan wrong. We discover that Job has faith only in God, not his possessions, not his property, not his workers, not his land, not his wealth, not his money, or even his children. So as we close off this session today with a lot to think about, I want you to consider this. What one thing is preventing or impeding your faith in God? Could it be a big question? Could it be a suffering? Could it be a possession, a person, or a problem in this life? Take some time to seriously reflect on this and consider what you might need to lay aside to live a life of greater faith in God. Faith in a great and sovereign God. One that would bring you to the point that you can make this proclamation, the proclamation of Job. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Guys, thanks so much for joining me today. I pray that you'll take some time to do an actionable today that will put this to work. And I'll see you right back here again next time.